The Phantoms of Hildesheim. The moonless night of May 9, 1940, was thick with an unnatural silence at the twin airfields of Köln-Ostium and Köln-Butzweilerhof. On the tarmac sat 42 skeletal aircraft, their fabric wings stretched taut over wooden frames like primordial bats. These were not bombers or fighters, they were DFS-230 transport gliders, tethered by long ropes to their Ju-52 tow planes. Inside the cramped fuselage of one of these gliders, Sergeant Helmut Wenzel of Assault Group Granite clenched the wooden bench, the rough fabric of his specialized jump smock chafing his neck. He and the 77 other men of the Sturmabteilung Koch Assault Detachment, were about to become ghosts. For 6 months, they had lived as phantoms, confined to a top-secret, sealed training area near Hildesheim. Their mail was censored, all contact with the outside world severed. They had practiced relentlessly, memorizing every inch of a full-scale replica of their target, a place whose name they had only just learned, Fort Ebenemail. The objective seemed impossible, a suicide mission whispered in the highest echelons of the OKW. They were to land on top of Europe's strongest fortress, a concrete monster bristling with artillery, and decapitated before it could even awaken. The air was heavy with the smell of engine oil, canvas, and the nervous sweat of young men on the cusp of history. At 4:30 German time, the first Ju-52 roared to life, its engines shattering the stillness. The tow rope snapped taut. Wenzel felt a lurch, a jarring shudder, as his glider, carrying 9 other men and a half-ton of unknown, powerful explosives, was dragged into the pre-dawn darkness. The invasion of the West had begun, not with the rumble of tanks, but with the whisper of wings. The concrete behemoth. Fort Ebenemail slept. Deep beneath 200 acres of grassy plateau, and a labyrinth of tunnels stretching for miles, the Belgian garrison felt secure. Major Jean Jatrand, the fort's commander, had over 1,200 men at his disposal, though only about 700 were on duty. The fortress was a self-contained world. It had its own power station, hospital, and barracks buried under layers of reinforced concrete. Above ground, its power was projected through steel and concrete blisters dotting the surface like iron mushrooms. 12 artillery casemates and retractable turrets, housing powerful 75mm and 120mm cannons, commanded the Albert Canal and the surrounding countryside. Dozens of machine gun posts and anti-aircraft positions provided a seemingly impenetrable defense. The Belgians knew an attack was imminent, war warnings had been issued for days. But their doctrine, their very mindset, was conditioned by the wars of the past. They watched the roads, the bridges, the canal. They scanned the horizon for infantry, for tanks, for bombers. No one ever looked straight up. The concept of a vertical assault, a landing directly onto the roof of the fortress, was beyond the realm of imagination. It was a failure of foresight that would prove catastrophic. As the Belgian soldiers in the surface blockhouses stared into the gloom towards Germany, they were oblivious to the silent menace descending from the sky, a threat moving not horizontally across the earth, but vertically from the heavens, carried on the thin fabric wings of unpowered aircraft. The fortress, designed to withstand any shell, was about to be undone by its own roof. The garrison's greatest defense, its concrete shell, was about to become its tomb. Cutting the cord. Over the German border near Aachen, at an altitude of 8,500 feet, the moment of truth arrived. The flight had been a tense, nerve-wracking journey through the blackness. The tow ropes, humming under strain, had snapped on 2 of the 11 gliders destined for the fortress roof, forcing them to land prematurely in Germany. But 9 remained. Inside glider number 4, Lieutenant Rudolf Witzig, commander of Assault Group Granite, peered through the small plexiglass window. Below, the world was a dark, featureless map. His pilot shouted over the roar of the wind, 5 minutes to release. The men checked their weapons one last time, MP-38 submachine guns, pistols, grenades, and the mysterious new weapon, the Holodom, or hollow charge. These were 50-kilogram explosive devices designed not to shatter concrete with brute force, but to focus a jet of molten metal that could burn through steel and concrete like a blowtorch. It was untested in combat. The fate of their mission rested on this new technology and their own sheer audacity. The red light flickered on. Release. Release! Release! The pilot yanked the lever. With a violent thwack, the tow rope fell away. The deafening roar of the Ju-52's engines vanished, replaced by an eerie, whistling hiss of wind over the glider's wings. They were now a projectile, a silent arrow aimed at the heart of Belgium's defense. For the men inside, it was a moment of terrifying commitment. There was no engine, no second chance, no turning back. There was only the descent, gravity, and the target looming somewhere in the darkness below. The silent landing. The descent was surreal. After the engine noise, the whistling quiet felt both peaceful and terrifyingly final. The 9 gliders of Assault Group Granite, now separated and operating independently, spiraled down towards the dark mass of the fortress plateau. They were phantoms on the wind. On the ground, at approximately 5:25 Belgian time, 1 hour behind German time, a Belgian sentry near the canal heard a strange rustling sound, like the wind tearing at a giant canvas. He looked up, confused, and saw a monstrous, dark shape with wide wings sweep just over his head before landing with a screech of wooden skids on the grassy roof of the fortress. Before he could even raise his rifle, the side door of the glider burst open and gray-clad figures spilled out, firing their automatic weapons. Within seconds, other gliders were landing across the triangular plateau, each touching down with uncanny precision next to its assigned objective. Lieutenant Witzig's glider, unfortunately, had its tow rope snap earlier, and he had landed far away, leaving Sergeant Major Wenzel in command of the initial assault. There was no time for hesitation. Wenzel's glider skidded to a halt mere yards from casemate 12, its twin 75mm cannons still pointing impotently towards Germany. The paratroopers scrambled out, their training taking over. 2 men rushed forward, lugging the heavy 50 kilograms hollow charge. They slammed it against the steel observation dome of the turret, lit the fuse, and sprinted for cover. The world held its breath for 10 seconds. The dragon's teeth are broken. The explosion was not a deafening roar, but a sharp, concussive crack. A brilliant white flash momentarily lit up the pre-dawn gloom. When the smoke cleared, the steel dome of the observation post was gone, a gaping, molten hole in its place. The paratroopers swarmed the opening, dropping smaller explosive charges down into the turret's mechanism, wrecking the guns and killing the crew. The fortress had been blinded and its first tooth pulled. Across the roof, the scene was repeated with stunning speed and brutal efficiency. At Cupola 120, a massive retractable turret with 2 120mm guns, the fort's most powerful artillery, another team placed their hollow charge. The resulting blast blew the entire 25-ton turret clean out of its housing. At other positions, the commandos used smaller 12.5 kilograms charges to blow open the steel doors of bunkers and casemates, then tossed grenades inside, silencing the machine gun nests. The Belgian defenders on the surface were caught in a whirlwind of confusion and terror. They were being attacked from everywhere at once, by an enemy who had appeared from nowhere. The explosions were surgical, precise, and utterly devastating. In less than 15 minutes, the small band of German paratroopers, numbering fewer than 80 men, had systematically destroyed or disabled 7 of the fort's 12 main artillery positions. The impregnable fortress, the concrete behemoth that was the key to the Allied defense of the West, had been functionally neutralized by a handful of men before it had a chance to fire a single meaningful shot into Germany. The dragon was broken. Chaos in the labyrinth. Deep below the surface, the fortress was a symphony of chaos. The first hollow charge detonation sent seismic shocks shuddering through the concrete tunnels. Lights flickered and died, plunging sections of the 3-level underground barracks and corridors into absolute darkness. Emergency generators sputtered to life, casting long, dancing shadows that magnified the panic. The telephone exchange, the fort's nervous system, was a cacophony of frantic, contradictory reports. "We are under air attack," one voice screamed. "Explosions on the roof," yelled another. "Gas attack near Blockhaus, someone reported, mistaking the acrid smoke from the German explosives for poison gas. Major Jotrand, the commander, was trapped in this web of confusion. His surface observation posts were being eliminated one by one, cutting his eyes and ears from the battle raging directly above his head. He tried to dispatch counterattack squads to the surface, but their progress was agonizingly slow. The paratroopers, anticipating this, had secured the primary stairwells leading to the roof. As Belgian soldiers, armed only with rifles against submachine guns, tried to ascend into the open, they were met with withering fire and cascades of grenades, turning the concrete stairways into deadly funnels of shrapnel and ricocheting bullets. The fortress, designed to project power outwards, had no contingency for fighting an enemy that was already inside its perimeter, on its very skin. It was an organism attacking its own infection, but the infection was already in the bloodstream, methodically shutting down its vital organs from the outside in. The bridge at Veldwezelt. While Sergeant Wenzel's men crippled the fortress itself, the second, equally vital phase of the operation was unfolding just a few kilometers away. At precisely 5:30, 10 gliders from Assault Group Steel, commanded by Lieutenant Gustav Altmann, crash-landed at the western end of the Veldwezelt bridge. Their arrival was just as shocking as the one at the fort. Belgian sentries, bleary-eyed in the morning mist, were cut down in seconds. The commandos' objectives were simple and brutal: seize the bridge intact. They knew the Belgians had wired it for demolition. Every second counted. Altmann's men sprinted across the 120-meter span, their boots pounding on the steel roadway. A machine gun nest in a bunker on the far side opened up, its tracers zipping through the air. One team of paratroopers laid down suppressing fire while another raced for the bunker, pried open its steel door with a crowbar, and silenced it with grenades. Another group scrambled under the bridge, frantically searching for the demolition charges. They found the wires leading to the main charge and, with wire cutters, severed the connection just as a desperate Belgian sapper tried to trigger the plunger. Within 8 minutes of landing, Altmann sent the coded success signal, birdsong. The bridge at Veldwezelt, a critical artery for the 4th Panzer Division, was in German hands. The first cut through the Allied defensive line had been made, clean and deep. Fire and fury at Vrouwenhoven. The story was bloodier at the Vrouwenhoven Bridge, a few kilometers south. Here, the 10 gliders of Assault Group Concrete, under Lieutenant Alfred Koch, landed amidst a hornet's nest. The Belgian defenders, commanded by the resolute Lieutenant Colonel Jiganon, were more alert. As the gliders skidded to a halt, they were met with immediate and intense machine gun fire. The paratroopers spilled out into a hail of bullets. Lieutenant Koch was hit and gravely wounded almost immediately. Undeterred, his second-in-command, Sergeant Major Karl-Heinz Lemm, took charge. The Germans, outnumbered and exposed, fought with desperate ferocity. They were pinned down, unable to rush the bridge as planned. From the south, the still-active artillery of Fort Eben-Emael began to find its range. The fort's remaining 75mm guns, though unable to target the fortress roof, could still fire on the surrounding area. Shells began to explode around the bridge, kicking up fountains of dirt and shrapnel, threatening to destroy the very prize the paratroopers were fighting to capture. The Germans at Vrouwenhoven were caught in a vice, heavy fire from the Belgian bridge defenders in front of them, and artillery raining down from the supposedly neutralized fortress behind them. Their audacious plan was teetering on the brink of disaster, their survival depended on the speed of the approaching panzers. The Ghost Commander. Back on the roof of Eben-Emael, Sergeant Wenzel consolidated his small force. They had accomplished their primary mission with shocking efficiency, but now a new, dangerous phase began, holding the roof against a garrison of over 1,000 men. The Belgians, recovering from the initial shock, began to organize. Snipers took up positions in the few remaining undamaged blisters, their rifle shots cracking through the air. Mortar fire from outside the fort began to walk its way across the plateau. The paratroopers were isolated, a tiny island of gray uniforms in a sea of enemies. Their link to the outside world was a single radio, and their only hope for relief were the panzer divisions they had just cleared the way for. It was during this tense stalemate that Lieutenant Rudolf Witzig, the rightful commander of Assault Group Granite, finally arrived. After his glider's tow rope snapped, he had landed near Cologne, commandeered a new Ju-52 tow plane, and heroically insisted on being flown back to the battle. landing his glider alone on the fortress roof hours after the initial assault. His sudden appearance was a tremendous morale boost to the beleaguered troopers. Taking command from Wenzel, Witzig immediately began organizing a more robust defense, repositioning his men and directing their fire against the increasingly bold Belgian counterattacks emerging from below. The Ghost Commander had returned to lead his phantoms. The unseen weapon's terror. The psychological impact of the hollow charge was as devastating as its physical effects. The Belgian soldiers trapped inside the targeted casemates who survived the initial blast were confronted with a hellish sight. Instead of a simple hole, they saw that the superheated jet of molten metal had sliced through inches of solid steel as if it were butter, spraying incandescent droplets around the interior and igniting anything flammable. The air was filled with the smell of ozone and burnt metal. This unseen, almost magical weapon created a sense of utter helplessness. How could concrete walls and steel cupolas protect them from a force that could melt its way through? Rumors spread through the tunnels like wildfire. The Germans possessed a death ray, a new superweapon that dissolved fortifications. This technological terror shattered the garrison's morale. The soldiers in the undamaged southern casemates, particularly those in casemates Mies and Mien which controlled the Meuse River, became hesitant to fire, fearing they would draw the attention of this new weapon. Major Jattrand found it increasingly difficult to compel his artillerymen to engage targets, as the crews believed that firing would reveal their position and invite instant, molten death from above. The greatest weapon the paratroopers had brought was not just the 50 kilograms charge, but the paralyzing fear it instilled in the minds of their enemy. The fight from below. As the morning of May 10th wore on, Major Jattrand and his officers, now operating from the command center deep within the earth, finally pieced together a coherent picture of the nightmare. The enemy was on the roof, small in number but heavily armed and dug in. The main artillery was silent. The bridges were under attack. Their fortress, their unbreachable home, was being dismantled from the top down. Resolve hardened into action. The only path to salvation was to physically expel the Germans from the roof. Jattrand ordered a series of coordinated counterattacks. He gathered every available soldier who wasn't essential for the remaining gun crews, clerks, technicians, off-duty infantrymen, and formed them into assault parties. Their mission was simple and terrifying: ascend the stairwells, storm the surface, and reclaim the plateau. The attacks began around 7 o'clock. Squads of Belgian soldiers, bayonets fixed, surged up the concrete stairs. But the Germans under Witzig were masters of defense. They had positioned their MG-34 machine guns to command the exits, creating deadly killing zones. Each time a steel door was thrown open, it was met with a furious blast of automatic fire that echoed like thunder in the enclosed stairwells. The Belgians pushed forward with immense courage, climbing over the bodies of their comrades, but the German fire was too precise, too overwhelming. They would gain a few feet, only to be driven back by grenades tossed down from above. The stairways became choked with smoke, bodies, and the screams of the wounded. The fortress was now warring with itself, its own internal passages transformed into brutal, close-quarters battlefields. The panzers arrive. At the Veldwezelt and Vrouwenhoven bridges, the beleaguered paratroopers were hanging on by a thread. At Vrouwenhoven, Sergeant Major Lem's men were taking casualties, pinned down by the Belgian defenders and harassed by Ebony Mail's remaining artillery. The success of the entire invasion of Belgium now balanced on a knife's edge. Then, on the horizon, they heard it. It began as a low rumble, a vibration felt in the teeth, before growing into the unmistakable mechanical roar of hundreds of engines and the clatter of tank treads. At approximately 6:45, the lead elements of the 4th Panzer Division, under General Major Johann von Kielmansegg, arrived at the canal. The sight of the panzers was like a shot of adrenaline for the exhausted paratroopers. The tanks of Panzer Regiment 35 and motorcycle infantry of Kratschützen Battalion 4 swarmed towards the captured bridges. At Veldwezelt, the crossing was swift. Tanks and armored cars poured across the captured span, fanning out to eliminate the remaining Belgian resistance and secure the bridgehead. At Vrouwenhoven, the arrival of the tanks tipped the scales decisively. A Panzer II rolled up to the main Belgian bunker that was pinning down Lem's men and blasted its defenders at point-blank range. The resistance crumbled. With tanks now on the western side of the Albert Canal, the first and most formidable defensive line of the Allies had been irrevocably breached. The Blitzkrieg could now begin its lightning dash into the heart of Belgium. The handful of glider troops had held on just long enough. A fortress surrounded. For the men inside Eben-Emael, the arrival of the German ground forces signaled the death of hope. The sounds of battle outside the fort shifted. The sporadic crack of Belgian rifles was replaced by the heavy thud of tank cannons and the chatter of German machine guns from beyond the fort's perimeter. Belgian units that had been moving to relieve the fortress were now themselves being attacked and pushed back by the spearhead of the German 151st Infantry Regiment. By midday, Eben-Emael was completely surrounded. The garrison was now not just fighting an enemy on its roof, but was cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or rescue. The psychological pressure intensified to an unbearable degree. Major Jatran received reports that the bridges at Veldwezelt and Vroenhoven were lost and that German tanks were operating freely on the west bank of the canal. His mission, to hold the canal crossings and prevent a German breakthrough, had failed. The fortress was no longer a strategic asset, it was a tomb, its garrison trapped with a deadly enemy overhead and a German army encamped around its base. The Germans on the ground began adding their own firepower to the assault, with 88mm flak guns brought up to fire directly at the remaining machine gun ports and observation slits, their high-velocity shells punching through the thick concrete with devastating effect. The walls were now closing in, both literally and figuratively. The final assault and the gas scare. Throughout the day, Witzig's paratroopers, now reinforced with fresh supplies of explosives ferried over by sappers from the 51st Pioneer Battalion who had crossed the canal, continued their systematic destruction. They moved from one hardened position to the next, blowing open steel doors and neutralizing weapon emplacements. One primary target remained, the powerful southern casemates, Mi-S and Mi-N, which had been sporadically firing on the German advance. The pioneers prepared a massive charge. But before they could launch their final attack, the Germans decided to use one more weapon, psychological warfare. Around noon on May 11th, the Germans prepared to pump TNT fumes into the ventilation system, hoping the smell would be mistaken for a poison gas attack and force a surrender. However, the plan proved unnecessary. A German officer, under a white flag, approached the main entrance and delivered an ultimatum to Major Jatran: surrender immediately, or the Luftwaffe would carpet bomb the entire fortress into oblivion. The officer made it clear that the battle outside was lost and further resistance was futile. For Jatran, the choice was agonizing. His fortress was crippled, his men were trapped and demoralized, and he was faced with the prospect of their annihilation for a cause that was already lost. The explosions from the roof had ceased, but the silence was now more menacing than the noise of battle. The white flag. Inside the command bunker, Major Jatran conferred with his officers. The situation was hopeless. They had sustained nearly 100 casualties, with 23 dead and 59 wounded. The water filtration system was damaged, the air was thick with smoke and fear, and the fortress's offensive capabilities were shattered. The German ultimatum, coupled with the threat of aerial bombardment, was the final blow. To continue the fight would be to condemn his remaining 1,000 men to a senseless death. His duty to his country had been superseded by his duty to his soldiers. With a heavy heart, at approximately 12:30 on May 11, 1940, just over 30 hours after the first gliders had landed, Major Jean Jatran ordered the white flag to be raised over the main entrance of Fort Eben-Emael. The paratroopers on the roof watched in stunned silence as the symbol of surrender was hoisted. Their impossible mission was over. Small groups of Belgian soldiers, dazed and grimy, began to emerge from the tunnels, their hands raised. The capture of Europe's strongest fortress had been achieved by fewer than 80 airborne soldiers, aided by a few hundred pioneers and the terror of a new weapon. The cost to the attackers was astonishingly light, 6 killed and 20 wounded. The impregnable bastion had fallen, and the road to France lay wide open. The surrender. The surrender was a surreal and somber affair. Out of the dark, cavernous entrances of the fortress, a river of Belgian soldiers emerged into the daylight, blinking in the unfamiliar sun. They were exhausted, shell-shocked, and humiliated. In front of them stood their captors, a small, battle-stained group of German paratroopers, looking almost as weary as the men to whom they had just dictated terms. The contrast in numbers was staggering. Over 1,100 Belgian soldiers were laying down their arms to a force that had numbered less than 100 on the initial assault. There was no cheering from the German side, only a quiet, professional efficiency. Lieutenant Witzig, the 26-year-old officer who had led the assault, met with Major Jotrand, the veteran Belgian commander. It was a meeting of two different eras of warfare, the old world of static, mighty fortifications giving way to the new world of speed, surprise, and three-dimensional assault. The captured Belgian soldiers were disarmed and marched away into captivity, their faces a mixture of disbelief and despair. Their impregnable fortress, a symbol of national pride and military engineering, had been defeated in just over a day by a handful of men who fell from the sky. A propaganda masterpiece. The news of Ebony-Mail's fall spread like wildfire. For the Allies, it was a catastrophic shock that sent tremors through their entire command structure. The linchpin of their defensive strategy, the Dill Plan, was broken before it could even be fully implemented. With the Albert Canal line breached, German panzer divisions were already fanning out into the Belgian plain, outflanking the Allied forces rushing to meet them. For Germany, it was a propaganda coup of the highest order. The Nazi propaganda minister, Josef Goebbels, seized on the story, plastering it across every newspaper and broadcasting it on every radio station. The paratroopers were hailed as heroes, titans of the new German military. Newsreels showed dramatic, and often reenacted, footage of the assault, highlighting the innovative tactics and the miracle weapon, the hollow charge. Hitler himself awarded every participant of the assault the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. The fall of Ebony-Mail was presented to the world as undeniable proof of the supremacy of German arms, the genius of the Führer's strategic vision, and the unstoppable power of the Blitzkrieg. It was a potent message that demoralized Germany's enemies and sowed doubt and fear across Europe. The lessons not learned. In the immediate aftermath, military analysts around the world scrambled to understand what had happened. How could the unconquerable be conquered so easily? The lessons were stark and revolutionary. First, it proved that in modern warfare, no static defense was truly impregnable. The age of the fortress was over. Second, it showcased the devastating potential of airborne forces, not as massed infantry drops, but as elite, surgical strike units capable of achieving strategic objectives far behind enemy lines. Third, it demonstrated the power of combined arms. The gliders provided the surprise, the elite commandos provided the specialized skills, the hollow charges provided the technological edge, and the panzers provided the decisive follow-through. It was a perfectly synchronized symphony of destruction. Yet, while the world watched in awe, the lessons were not universally applied. The British and Americans were spurred to accelerate the development of their own airborne divisions, but the sheer audacity and pinpoint precision of the Ebony-Mail raid would rarely be replicated. The operation remained a unique masterpiece of military planning and execution. The fate of the victors and the vanquished. The fates of the key figures were as varied as the fortunes of war. Most of the paratroopers of Sturmabteilung Koch were reformed and sent to participate in the next major German airborne operation, the invasion of Crete in May 1941. There, they would face a very different battle. Forewarned by intelligence, the British and Commonwealth defenders were waiting. The German Fallschirmjäger suffered horrendous casualties, a victory so costly that Hitler forbade any large-scale airborne assaults for the remainder of the war. Many of the heroes of Ebony-Mail would not survive Crete. Lieutenant Witzig survived the war, fighting on both the eastern and western fronts, and later became a colonel in the post-war West German Army, the Bundeswehr. Major Jotrand and his men spent the war in German POW camps. After the war, Jotrand and his senior officers faced a court of inquiry for the swift surrender of the fort, but were ultimately exonerated, as the court recognized the unprecedented nature of the attack and the hopelessness of their situation. The fortress itself, scarred and battered, remains a silent monument to the battle, now a museum where visitors can walk the dark tunnels and gaze upon the mangled steel cupolas that were torn apart in a single morning. Historical significance: the opening act. The fall of Fort Eben-Emael was more than just a single, dramatic battle. It was the opening act of the Battle of France and the definitive demonstration of blitzkrieg in the West. By neutralizing the fort and seizing the canal bridges, this small operation single-handedly unhinged the entire Allied defensive strategy. It allowed the German Sixth Army to pour into Belgium, pinning the best Allied mobile units while the main German armored thrust of Army Group A sliced through the Ardennes to the south, encircling and trapping them. The chain reaction that began with the silent glide onto the fortress roof would lead directly to the Dunkirk evacuation, the fall of Paris, and the complete defeat of France in just 6 weeks. It was a textbook example of a force multiplier, where a small, specialized unit achieved a result far out of proportion to its size. The audacious, visionary, and terrifyingly successful assault on Eben-Emael was not just a battle, it was the gunshot that started the race, and it heralded a new, faster, and more ruthless form of warfare that would define the Second World War.